Hi, hello, welcome back to Offbeat Gyan. This video is on the novel When Memory Dies. The first two chapters are dealt with in this short video. This novel, When Memory Dies, is by the author A. Sivanandan. He is a Sri Lankan British novelist, and the novel belongs to the genre of historical fiction. It has a first-person narrative, and the novel is divided into 3 books. The setting of the novel is Sri Lanka, and the period that is covered in the novel is the early 20th century. That is, the novel begins somewhere around the early 20th century, and it chronicles the lives of people in Sri Lanka up to the 1980s. The themes of the novel: it talks about the impact of British colonialism on the people in Sri Lanka. It depicts the different lifestyle and the attitudes of the Sinhala people, who were mostly concentrated in the southern part of Sri Lanka, and the Tamil people, who were concentrated in the northern part of Sri Lanka. It talks about the impact of religious conversion. The Sinhalas were Buddhists and the Tamils were Hindus, and the Sinhalas, the Tamils and the Muslims, these are the majority population concentrated in various parts of Sri Lanka. And it talks about the divide and rule policy which was followed by the British government to keep the people apart so that they could carry on their trade, their exploitation of the local population, and continue to rule over Sri Lanka. The same policy that they followed in India. And the novel also reflects the conflict between the ethnic identity and the externally imposed Christian identity. So coming to chapter 1, the protagonist of the novel is Sahadevan, of book 1 is Sahadevan, and the story is narrated by Sahadevan's son. The novel begins by talking about the rains. It begins by talking about the time when Sahadevan, the protagonist of book 1, was a young boy. The monsoon rains that battered the trees, birds, plantains, and the birds and animals made him feel sad for them, and for his poor classmate Sanji, who didn't attend school because he had no shoes. The monsoon rains pouring down from the skies and then the lifting of the rains filled him with relief, fear, joy, and wonder. Sahadevan says that it was the rains that connected him to his country and made him want to tell its story. The novel then describes the arrival of colonialism in Sri Lanka with the landing of the Portuguese Lord Don Lourenço de Almeida in 1505. The narrator describes the impact of colonialism, the pain and the stigma it created in the hearts and minds of the Sri Lankan people. Sahadevan says that the people of Sri Lanka carried very painful memories of colonialism, and it had become a part of their soul. They could lose their memories only by losing their memory itself. Sahadevan worked in the post office. He was born in Sandlipe, a dry village in the northern part of Sri Lanka. Sahadevan's father, the narrator's grandfather, was a failed farmer. The villagers called him the man with the green penis because he had 13 children. 9 of them survived, 5 sons and 4 daughters. Sahadevan was the youngest. Sahadevan's father concentrated on his education and was keen on procuring a job for him in the British Raj. By the time Sahadevan was 12 years old, he was a precociously intelligent kid. He was fluent in English and Tamil. He was a bookworm who read all the time. His headmaster was deeply impressed by the boy's intelligence and persuaded Mr. Pandian, Sahadevan's father, to send him to a proper college, St. Benedict's College in Colombo. Now, Pandian talks about his financial difficulties to the headmaster, and the headmaster says that Segaram, Pandian's brother-in-law, is keen to help Sahadevan. Pandian and Segaram a dry fish trader, did not get along well with each other. They did not see eye to eye on many matters. And Pandian was very angry with Segaram because he had been deprived of his dowry by Segaram. That is how he looks at the whole situation. But Segaram was very interested in Sahadevan and he was willing to sponsor his education and other expenses. So finally, Pandian puts aside his ego and he agrees to the arrangement. And Sahadevan is sent to St. Benedict's College, which is a Catholic institution in northern Colombo. Sahadevan excelled in school. He was a brilliant student. He won the scripture prize also. But his father and his uncle could no longer support him and he had to leave Colombo. So Pandian had become extremely impoverished because he had sold off some of his land to marry off his two eldest daughters. Two of his sons had also married. One had fallen down from a palmyra tree while tapping toddy. So two unmarried daughters, Saraswati and Lakshmi, remained. And their house also was on the verge of collapse. So Pandian did not have any money to further support the studies of Sahadevan. And Segaram had also lost his company. His dry fish company had been taken over by the Anglo Fish Corporation. And for a certain period of time, they had also absorbed Sahadevan into the company because by taking Sahadevan, they would be able to tap the contacts of Segaram. And for some time, Sahadevan was employed by the Anglo Fish Corporation and he deeply impressed its director, Mr. Thompson. But soon, Pandian recalled Sahadevan back to Sandlipe in Jaffna. The old man had perpetually fought a losing battle with his land. So finally, he had given up his battle with the land. All his land had been disposed of and he had to manage what he used to own once upon a time. He was given some rice and vegetables in return for working on the farms that once belonged to him and that he had been forced to sell. So Pandian was heartbroken by the loss of his land, the selfish demands of his sons-in-laws, their indifference and his inability to keep his family together. So he had become sick and he had started drinking. And so Sahadevan's grandmother asked him to come back and look after the family lands and the family too. Mahadev, the eldest, should have taken the responsibility, but he was a labor contractor who worked with his father-in-law to provide laborers for road works of the British government. So Pandian's second son was the crippled Rama, who had fallen from a tree, and he spent all his time in religious activities. So Sahadevan left Colombo and he returned to Sandlipe and he worked very hard for 2 years on the farm. He was able to make some profit and he was also able to convince his brothers-in-law to invest some money in farming. But then there was severe shortage of labor, as the Roman Catholic priests had promised the lower caste Nallavans or the laborers to convert to the RC faith and told them that they would go to heaven if they did so. Sahadevan had struggled very hard, but soon Pandian realized that it was futile to keep on making him work on the farm. And he felt that it was better if his son had a good government job, some clerical post in the British government. Because the British government seemed to favor educated Tamil youth. Pandian had at once upon a time loved the challenge of being a farmer, constantly battling the climate and the land. But in his old age, he yearned for two things: security and respect. He had great hopes from Sahadevan. He believed that Sahadevan would be the savior of the family and that he would be able to better the prospects of the family. So Sahadevan returned to Colombo when he was 19 years old. He became a clerical servant in the postal department and he started living with a Sinhala family in Slave Island. He sent some money home and kept away from the distractions of the city. Soon, he became a junior clerk, grade 4, and he decided to go back home to see his family. So he bought a lot of gifts for his family, for his sisters, their children, and he went back home. He travelled by train and he was taken home by Velan, the cart driver. Velan and Sahadevan share memories of their shared past when Velan used to carry the little Sahadevan around on his back. Velan looked into the past and told Sahadevan that he had lost his wife and son to a terrible fever. Velan had lost all hope. He had sold off his land and bought the cart. He felt land without sons is useless. Sahadevan was very warmly welcomed by his family. Special lunch was prepared for him. All his favorite delicacies were made by his mother, and he was addressed as Colombo uncle by his nephews and nieces. Sahadevan had provided money to dig a new well, and the family was very happy to see him. And he looks at his mother, and he is very concerned about his mother because his mother was suffering from spells of dizziness. And he realizes that repeated pregnancies and the hard life had sucked out her strength. But she was a strong and gentle woman. Two of his sisters, they were still unmarried. So Sahadevan took the decision that he must save more money and send it home to support his parents and enable them to have a better life. So he returned to Colombo. He gave up his rooms with the Sinhala family and he joined a chamari, which was led by a man called Uncle Nayagam. Now this was a chamari in a place called Kotahena. This was a group of men staying together to share expense and reduce their burden. And this Uncle Nayagam had spent most of his life away from his family. So Sahadevan took the decision that he would never live like Uncle Nayagam, cut off from his family, separated from the joys of family life. There were many like Nayagam who were sent by the British government to distant parts of Sri Lanka to set up roads, railways and post offices. They travelled with a camp bed and a tin trunk across the country, leaving behind their wife and children. Nayagam had a cousin called Velu who would have been called an engineer had he been of white race. He was sent to remote areas to build roads through jungles, and soon he disappeared. There was no news of him. So Sahadevan took the decision that he did not want to become like Nayagam and Velu. He compares the lives of the Sinhala people in the southern part of Sri Lanka, that is in Colombo and surrounding areas. The villages and towns in this part of the country were not torn apart by the roads and railway lines. On the other hand, in the northern part of the country, his homeland, the railways had split through coconut plantations and paddy fields, disrupting the life of the people and compelling landless farmers to migrate to the southern part of Sri Lanka. Life in the green and lush south was much more friendlier, it was much more warmer, and it was much better than in the hostile and harsh northern part of Sri Lanka. He rediscovered some joy in life which had been missing. During his conversation with his Sinhala friend Tissa, Sahadevan is irritated when Tissa says that Tamils in Colombo are a sad lot with no joy or spirit. They discuss the difference in land, life and climate in the northern and southern parts of Sri Lanka. One day, Tissa invites Sahadevan to his home near Kalutara. Tissa's green and beautiful village is nothing like Sahadevan's Sandlipe. The warmth, hospitality and the food is good. Tissa also seems more respectful, helpful and gentler, very different from his overconfident and brash self in Colombo. Sahadevan soon returns to Colombo with a change in perspective regarding the Sinhalese or the southern folk. He also undergoes a change in attitude. He realized that the land and the weather in the southern part of Sri Lanka were much better, and that made the people more cheerful and outgoing. His own people had to battle the elements and they were kind, but they also realized the cost of being generous. he decides to relax a bit. He is aware of his responsibilities, but he also decides that he must enjoy life. And he often brought back his Sinhala friends to his chamari. Soon, the chamari breaks up. Uncle Nayagam rejoins his family after taking up a minor position near his home. And the next phase of Sahadevan's life begins with him going to stay in Tissa's uncle and aunt's house. He begins life in the Vijaypala household. With this, chapter 1 comes to an end. Moving on to chapter 2. S.W. or Samuel Vijaypala had given up his Christian first name, Samuel. He had worked in the railways for over 40 years. He was a spirited union leader and a committed worker. He was one of the leaders of the 1912 rail strike, but he was remembered for his charges of racial and religious bigotry he had made against his employers before the Royal Commission of Inquiry in 1913. He had become a national hero after referring to the commissioners as Parashuddhas or bastard whites. Despite their best efforts, his employers had failed to remove him from service. He was 61 years old, unpromoted but still in service. An experienced fitter and foreman, he was indispensable for the railway board. Sahadevan was unaware of all this when he went to live in the Vijaypala's house. S.W. came across as a stern and reserved man. Prema, his wife, was a complete contrast. She was cheerful and roly-poly. She used to keep making something or the other for Tissa. Both S.W. and Prema were deeply attached to their nephew, Tissa. They did not have children of their own. And S.W. was usually very indifferent to Sahadevan, and Sahadevan also did not bother to break down his defense. So Prema tries to create a rapport between S.W. and Saha or Sahadevan. She tries to explain S.W.'s commitment to the cause of the Sri Lankan rail workers employed by the British government. And she talks to him about the 1912 strike. She talks to Saha about the other men who had stood with S.W. in that strike of 1912. All of them had suffered. Some had been exiled. And Prema explains to Saha that S.W. and his friends were trying to set up a fully functional workers' union. S.W. feared that he would not be able to complete the task before he died. So she informs him that S.W. had drafted a petition to the railway board demanding compensation for the death of a railway plateman, Sirisena. Sirisena had been run over by a railway engine driven by Mr. Russell, and the management had refused to give him compensation, saying that Sirisena had been careless. Sirisena left behind a crippled wife and 6 children. Prema explains all this to Saha while stitching children's clothes. She had taken up stitching when S.W.'s suspension was going on and his salary had been reduced to half pay. So she continued stitching and helping out poor people. And then Prema asks Saha about Tissa. It's been quite some time since Tissa has come to visit them, and Tissa arrives quite a few days later, and both S.W. and Prema are delighted to see him. But soon an argument develops between Tissa and S.W. over Tissa's fascination with a labor leader called Guna Sinha. S.W. dislikes the man because Guna Sinha is not a worker. So they talk about the British policies, they talk about the labor policies, they talk about creating a workers' union, and Saha contemplates on the contrasting personality of S.W. and Prema. Now, he still has not been able to understand S.W. Although he wants to get close to the man and understand him, it is very difficult because S.W. is a man of a stern behavior. He is not somebody that you can get close to very easily. But one day, when Sahadevan goes to visit the temple after coming to know that his mother was sick, S.W. senses that Sahadevan was worried about his sick mother. So he asks him to return to Sandlipe. He says that he will help Sahadevan to get a medical certificate, and he makes him return to Sandlipe to meet his dying mother. In fact, he also sends a telegram informing the family about Sahadevan's arrival. When Sahadevan arrives at the railway station, he is very happy to see Mahadevan, his elder brother, waiting for him, and he comes to know that SW had already sent a telegram. When he comes home, he finds that his mother is ailing, she is very sick, and she is about to die. And then she informs him about their half-brother Para. She begs him to be good to Para. She asks him to look after his sisters, and she dies. And Saha asks Mahadevan about their half-brother Para. Mahadevan tells him that Pandian had fallen in love with the new midwife Ponnamma, who had come to deliver Sahadevan. It had been a difficult delivery, and Ponnamma had taken care of both Pandian and his wife. Sahadevan's mother had supported the widowed Ponnamma and her child Para. They had been good friends, and their mother had never nursed any bitterness or anger towards Ponnamma. She had been extremely loving to Para also. And Pandian also had created special time to spend with Para. So Para had a very warm relationship with both Pandian and Sahadevan's mother. Now the preparations for the cremation were going on, but the heavy rains happened and it continued for 2 days. So the cremation was delayed, and the house was crowded with useless relatives who kept on eating and drinking and creating more burden for Saraswati and Lakshmi, who were constantly in the kitchen preparing something or the other for the relatives. Pandian also was waiting for all the relatives to disperse, and then Saha said that they should probably carry the mother's body to the cemetery and get the cremation done over there, and that is how the cremation happens. 2 days later, Saha leaves for Sandlipe, and Mahadevan asks him to look for a job for Para. With this, we come to the conclusion of the second chapter of Book 1 of A. Sivanandan's novel, When Memory Dies. Thank you.